Hugo Rifkind on Times Radio with Net Wealth. Wealth management as it should be.
Good morning, this is Hugo Rifkind here on Times Radio with news, current affairs, culture and conversation right up until 1pm. My news review to come shortly with topics ranging from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, obviously, to the end of the TV show that ironically taught us that everybody needs good neighbours. Elsewhere in the show, after 12, I'll be speaking to the leading Ukrainian novelist Andrei Kirkov. He'll be discussing the situation there and talking about receiving information that he's on Russia's wanted list. I'll be talking to the award-winning crime writer Anne Cleves about her latest book, The Heron's Cry. The comedian Sarah Kendall will be talking about Series 2 of her comedy drama Frayed, and we'll have up-to-the-minute political analysis from Caroline Wheeler of The Sunday Times. After 11, meanwhile, I'll be speaking to the Times diplomatic correspondent Catherine Philp with the latest from Ukraine, and with the Man Booker Prize-winning novelist Howard Jacobson. He'll be discussing his memoir Mother's Boy. And I'll have the TV review with Jenny Colgan, taking in the returning dramas Peaky Blinders and Killing Eve, as well as the documentary Chernobyl, The Lost Tapes, and Amanda Seyfried in The Dropout. So, questions and comments about anything on the show, including any of that or anything else, you know how to get in touch. You can text us on 87222, start your message with the word Times. You can tweet us at Times Radio, or you can email us on studio@times.radio. But before all of that, as ever, I start the show with 1 hour on 7 days. And joining me to look back on the week's news are the Deputy Online Editor of The New Statesman, Rachel Cunliffe. Hello, Rachel.
Good morning.
Good morning. And the comedian Alistair Barry. Hello, Alistair.
Hello, Hugo. How are you?
I'm very well, I think, so far. Look, thanks both of you very much indeed for being with me. Look, it's been an astonishing week, right? A week that sort of changes how you see both the past and the future, and a lot turns around in the mind. And such weeks are pretty hard to get your head around. Nonetheless, let's try. We'll focus on the detail of various bits of Russia's war in Ukraine pretty soon. But let's start with the big picture. Alistair, what have you been basically thinking this week?
That's a fairly large question, isn't it? I have been thinking, do you know what struck me was I thought about the Spanish Civil War. I think this is the first time in my lifetime that you look at something like the brigades in the Spanish Civil War and sort of understand the basis behind the impetus to go and fight.
Of
and I don't
course.
wish to sound as though I'm about to strap on some armour and head out there, because I think I would be the last thing they need is another comedian. I think the one they've got is doing rather better. But no, it's almost too huge a question to answer, which is a terrible thing for a pundit to come.
No. I mean, that's exactly the sort of answer I was looking for, because I mean, you know, the mind sort of flails around looking for purchase. I think that's a sort of a fantastic point. There have been various wars in my lifetime where, you know, people have sort of wanted to go and join on one side or the other, and you're always like, well, that's a nuanced picture. You know, maybe you're missing something here. Whereas now you can absolutely see, well, somebody with the ability and the drive would. I mean, it's, you know, it seems very clearly to be a fight with a good side and a bad side, and you know what side you want to be on.
I think there's also I think there is also something that is very different, which is the extent of the information overload that we receive. I haven't been quite as online as I might have been, just because there's so much stuff and you don't know what's misinformation, what's disinformation. And, you know, Twitter and Facebook, I mean, there is an element to which Russia have now banned Twitter and Facebook, and you sort of think, well, that's not such a bad thing. But then they've also got rid of YouTube, so God knows what my children would watch. But there is so much, and almost you don't, I mean, I've got various images in my head that I've seen online, but there's also quite a lot of stuff that you've just gone, I don't actually want to see this. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because there is so much information because of the nature of the internet and the modern world.
Well, we'll get into I guess what we have to call the meme war in a minute. But Rachel, first from you, what's your sort of your big picture look at the last week?
Well, just on what Alistair was saying, my great uncle did go to Spain to fight in the Spanish Civil War, and I agree completely. You've got some of those. You can see why. And it is interesting to see that in previous conflicts that I can remember, there has been a lot of, well, both sides are bad, really, and what you're not understanding is this, and very clever people on the internet telling you why actually you're wrong to think that one side is right. And we've barely had that at all here. There was some polling done yesterday where they sort of polled the British public on what they thought about Putin, and most of them are things that I cannot repeat on the radio, but pretty unanimous view there. In terms of how I've been following this, it is information overload. Some of the videos coming out sort of directly from the front line, as it were, Ukrainian soldiers posting videos to Telegram, and we can see it happening in real time. That certainly is new and can be overwhelming, but it's also kind of haven't had that experience of covering a conflict before. But then towards the end of the week, we got the risk of nuclear war, and suddenly that sort of took me straight back to my GCSE history classes, where we were discussing why is it that countries might near the edge of nuclear Armageddon, and talking about all the ways that all the mechanisms that were set up to avoid that happening. And it does feel that something that we were studying in history became very, very real, very fast. And that's not to catastrophize. I don't think there will be a nuclear war. I'm hoping very much that there won't be. But it did get very real very quickly, didn't it?
Well, that's what I mean about the way it makes you sort of, it changes your view of both the past and the future. Andrew Maxwell on this show last week, he said it was like with the end of the pandemic, it's like we've leapt from the back of one of the horsemen of the apocalypse to another one. And, just sort of without breaking stride. The information overload is a real thing. I wrote at the start of this week that, one thing you have to recognise and acknowledge that is Ukraine has just been tremendously good at branding itself. I don't mean that in a cynical way, but just you absolutely know now what the sort of the national ethos of Ukraine is, the sort of plucky brilliance, the kind of sort of the irreverence, the mockery of Russian aggression, and all these images of barefoot female MPs with AK-47s and Zelensky's formidable communication, and there was that video of the tractor stealing the broken down tank and all that kind of stuff. Alistair,
there's not just one of those, is there, Hugo? I think we can just introduce a little levity. The sort of proliferation of videos of Ukrainian tractors making off with every single form of Russian military hardware has got to be one of the comic highlights of what is not essentially a very comic affair. I sort of almost hate myself for saying this, but you're absolutely right. It's a very modern thing to say. They've branded themselves terribly well, haven't they?
They have.
That flag is an absolute winner. Just do what yellow and blue. Don't mess around. There's no difficulty with someone thinking it represents sort of racist overtones, or one country doesn't want to be part of it, or it's got a nasty tendency to turn up in the top left-hand corner of other people's flags. There's no controversy whatsoever. They even, or the name of it. Is it the Jack? Is it the Union Jack? There's no controversy around the Ukrainian flag. I live in Hertford. I live over the road from the county hall, and outside the county hall, believe me, when you want to talk about bins and stuff, I am not always the hugest fan of East Herts County Council, but they have got a huge yellow and blue flag flying on the county hall, and it's incredibly strong and incredibly... I just walked my kids to school past it the other day, and I stopped and took a photo. And I think as I said, it feels slightly facetious, but the branding of Ukraine, and this is the important thing as well, is Putin's insistence that Ukraine is not a country has been proven so utterly, utterly wrong. And Ukraine has, if anything, grown into one of the most sort of countries in the world, because absolutely everyone is unwavering in their support for them, apart from 5 countries, which we'll get onto later.
The flag, of course, is meant to represent its fields and sky, isn't it? It's the yellow crops down below, the blue sky up above. And I guess if they did do that in Hertfordshire, it'd be more of a kind of sort of brown at the bottom and grey at the top, wouldn't it?
How very dare you, Hugo? Those are fighting words.
The thing about the tractor, pulling the tanks and various hardware. Did you see that thing released? I think it was the Ukrainian tax office. They put out a press release saying that if you seized spoils of war with your tractor, you would not have to pay tax on their value come the end of the tax year. Which I thought, again, it's just like, I can remember people, probably including myself, sneering once at the idea of a country being run by a comedian. But God, it seems a good idea today. Rachel, look, anything that's stuck out? They've been, as you say, there've been so much sort of communication overload, so many videos, so many sort of images of bravery and all that. But is there anything particular that stuck with you?
So much. For one thing, I think that the Ukrainian farmers probably now have a defence service that could rival sort of a small country just from what they've managed to nick from the fields. There's a very moving video of, and of course you don't know that all of this stuff is real, and a lot of it's very hard to verify. There's a very moving video of some Ukrainians with a captured Russian soldier who looks like he's a teenager who didn't know that he was off to fight a war. He thought he was going to do military exercises, which of course is what they're told in Russia. And he's getting a cup of tea, I don't know, maybe with some vodka in it, and getting the chance to call his mum. And it's a bit of astounding PR if we're talking about branding. Look, we are the good guys. Look how well we're treating our opponents. But also feeds into how this is playing out in Russia. And there have been very distressing reports of people living in Ukraine calling their family members in Russia, and their parents or their uncles and aunts and siblings will not believe what's happening. They very clearly believe that all of the conflict is caused by Nazis in Ukraine, this phantom menace that Putin has conjured up, and that Russia are the good guys. And so videos like that really speak to the human side of it, I think are incredibly moving. The other one I liked was, and again, I don't speak Ukrainian, but apparently the translation when some Russian soldiers were taking a Ukrainian city, and they were informed that all of the women in this town are witches, and you won't be able to get a hard-on tomorrow.
Yes, so I think it was ever again. You are now cursed.
Ever again.
I read about that. Apparently, I forget the name of it. It's a town in Ukraine that is indeed famed for its women being witches, and there is a sort of famous curse, and so they were passing it on. Anyway, look, more with Alistair and Rachel in a moment. I should let you know while we're on the subject, and of course we're on the subject. Alexis Conran is here from 1 p.m, and among his guests will be the director of Amnesty Ukraine. That's Oksana Pokolchuk. She'll be speaking from the country about what more the international community could be doing to help. Do text us this morning, or tweet us, or email us indeed. You can text us on 87222. Start your message with the word Times. You can tweet us at Times Radio, or you can email us on studio@times.radio. This is Hugo Rifkind on Times Radio in association with NetWealth. Find out more at netwealth.com.
Times Radio's Brighter Breakfast with Jenny Kleeman and Luke Jones.
As you wake up, we will bring you the latest out of the crisis in Ukraine, and ahead of his sitcom being aired on Channel 4 finally, we'll hear about Volodymyr Zelensky's hit role.
Plus, we're going to give you the rundown of the 21 best songs of the 21st century, voted for by a panel on the Sunday Times Culture magazine, and we'll give you your chance to choose the 22nd.
Times Radio's Brighter Breakfast with Jenny Kleeman and Luke Jones. Tomorrow morning from 6 on Times Radio.
When you're ready to start planning your next holiday, come and talk with the luxury tailor-made travel experts at Kuoni. Discover why we're a Which recommended provider and offer exceptional flexibility on all holidays. For total peace of mind, trust Kuoni. ATOL protected and Which recommended. Visit kuoni.co.uk or your local store. Hugo Rifkind on Times Radio with NetWealth. Wealth management as it should be. Find out more at netwealth.com.
Hello, this is Hugo Rifkind here on Times Radio. It is 18 minutes past 10, and I am talking with the journalist Rachel Cunliffe and the comedian Alistair Barry about the news of the week, and obviously we are talking about the war in Ukraine. Guys, look, one aspect of this conflict that hasn't been discussed much, but struck me quite hard when I was watching footage of the sort of the tentative peace talks that they had for a small while last week, was the generational aspect of this conflict. I don't necessarily mean between the two sides, because obviously in general the populations are roughly the same age, but I mean between the leadership. You look and you see Ukraine as a country led by, I guess, a combination of millennials and Generation X, and then you look at Vladimir Putin's Russia, and these are sort of old waxworks in suits, as Prince Charles might wants to put it. It's really, really striking. You see, I mean, you have Zelensky appearing on videos in his military t-shirt, unshaven, talking a language that young people understanding social media. You have Vladimir Putin at his massive table alone in his palace. There's something very striking and generational going on here, don't you think, Alistair?
I think we can't possibly go any longer without mentioning the massive tables. Yes. I mean, I don't know how they get most of their office furniture through the doors of the Kremlin, but they have. What's actually almost more striking is his insistence on sitting everyone. There's a great picture of his Minister of Defence, and I can't remember, both sitting sort of on one corner together like naughty little schoolboys in some sort of Alice in Wonderland drawing. And it adds to that. It adds to the feeling that they are powerless, sort of.
It really does, doesn't it? Yeah.
Junior members, but it also makes Putin look utterly preposterous. And I think it did strike me as well. I was looking at these pictures, and I'm 50 now. I grew up with pictures of your Brezhnevs and your sort of stocky Russians in not particularly great suits, looking a little bit like, they didn't have that many. I don't want to be unnecessarily cruel to the Russians, but they didn't look like it was a sort of Technicolor dream back in the 70s and 80s.
You're talking a heavy potato diet here. That's what you're referring to. That's what you're referring to.
A great deal of starch.
Yeah.
And it struck me just looking at some of these guys. They're heavy set, thick, Brezhnev eyebrows and grey hair sculpted back, and it is very severe and very Soviet, and it does look as though almost from another age.
Yeah.
And then you sort of, and also that feeling of everything being so very controlled. I think one of the other, we were talking about clips we'd seen. I think what's incredibly moving is these clips of Ukrainians with no arms walking out in front of soldiers who are firing in the air. Soldiers who clearly don't really know what to do, because it's very difficult to open fire on a group of people with no arms just going, could you mind leaving our country? There's Hugh Grant just tweeted a shot of a chap with red trousers walking towards.
Oh, yes, I saw that,
and
yeah.
It reminded me of a slightly more hopeful version of Schindler's List.
Well, I mean, that's kind of what I meant, in that you do see this. You see these crowds of people facing down these young, bemused Russian soldiers, and these are people who clearly have much more in common with each other than any of them do with Vladimir Putin at his massive table with no friends. Rachel, let's cling onto the table for a little bit. Do you think the other people are sitting there, or do you think they've just photoshopped them in so that he doesn't to try and make the table look bigger so that he looks bigger? I don't know. I'm very confused by it all.
I was wondering about this because I was absolutely obsessed with Lord of the Rings when I was a teenager. I mean, what am I talking about? I still am. And I went to this exhibit at the Science Museum, I think it was, where they had lots of the costumes and the armour from it, but they also had an exhibit of how they did some of the special effects. And there was a thing you could do where you could have two people sitting in as hobbits, as it were, like against the same backdrop, but the backdrops were different sizes. And then they take a photo of you and it'd be like, oh, we're sitting next to each other, but one of you is a giant, like Gandalf, and one of you is a tiny hobbit.
I see where you're going.
Vladimir Baggins is coming.
I do wonder if there's some of that. I mean, if you saw the table in real life without the camera angles, would it actually be a really strange size and a really strange shape to try and give maximum prominence to Vladimir Putin? Not sure about that, but we should say that Putin was the master of the powerful photo shoot as well. He can forget him horseback riding shirtless and going to fight a tiger. I can't remember. He was very good at this stuff.
Yeah.
But now, as you say, he's been in power for more than 20 years. He's clearly been isolating himself, both figuratively and, it would seem, literally, on his massive table. And he's up against a comedian who, lest we forget, was the voice of the Ukrainian Paddington Bear. I'm not sure how much you can fight with that in terms of optics, other than preventing your citizens from encountering any of that content, which of course is what he's trying to do.
Yeah, indeed. And Alistair, as you said, I am in love with how they did actually get the table in. I'm wondering if there was something like that Friends episode where they got the sofa stuck halfway up the stairs.
It's probably some sort of IKEA thing, and they've got a selection of screws left over that they're not quite sure what to do with. But the Russian people must never find out about that. I do think
at the end that Putin never goes to has got a coaster wedged under it, so it doesn't wobble.
Just falls on Sergei Lavrov at some point. Yeah. No, I think the other thing to bear in mind, but this struck me yesterday, actually, the banning of Facebook and Twitter, and also 15 years for mentioning the word war.
Yeah.
I do feel terribly sorry for the Russian populace at large. They do seem as a group to have had some of the worst luck in history. Years of Tsarism, followed by Leninism, followed by Stalinism, followed by communism, followed by kleptocracy. Yeah. They've had a fairly rough time of it generally. But I do think if you've closed down, the younger generation in Russia have a lot of access, as all younger generations do, to online content. If all of that suddenly disappears, are you not likely to think perhaps this war is not going terribly well, whether you get the information or not?
You'd think so. I mean, and the press curbs are pretty horrifying. You know, the fact that, as you say, 15 years for spreading information deemed unhelpful to the war effort, which you can't call a war effort because you're not allowed to mention the war. And I mean, it puts some, the BBC suspended operations in Russia, I believe, and it puts all Western media sort of reporters in Russia, including our own, at dreadful risk if they for doing their job properly. I'm not quite sure how we're all going to handle that yet, but it's certainly a worrying thing. I was struck this week seeing it was two episodes, one with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and one with the foreign ministry spokesman Maria Zakharova, I think she's called, both being questioned by British journalists and both just sort of astonished at the tone that was being taken with them, in a kind of how dare you speak to me in this kind of way, like not even offended, more kind of like what on earth is happening that I get spoken to by a journalist in this fashion. And it was, I don't know, it was so sort of culturally, I don't know, it was very abrupt, the cultural difference there. And again, it made them look, I mean, because, so much of the world is global now. I mean, even in Russia, however much they try and shut down various forms of social media, TikTok, whatever, things will, narratives develop, ways of talking develop. And I think it just makes them ancient. It makes them look lost. Look,
possibly,
sorry.
Possibly, that's one of the advantages of having a comedian as the leader of Ukraine, is that he's much better at dealing with hecklers.
Yes, well, quite. Look, to turn to the UK for a moment, Rachel, how much should we be prepared to hurt here to do our bit? I mean, there are whole discussions about the extent to which we should be militarily involved, and I think most of us would probably think ideally not at all. But sanctions hurt us too. Moving away from Russian gas hurts us. Cracking down on oligarchs inevitably means money leaving the UK. I mean, do you think there's a sort of moral imperative for us to tighten our belts and do our bit?
I think there's a moral imperative for us to talk about the fact that sanctions, if they're going to work, by definition, hurt the countries that are imposing them. That's kind of the point of them. And there hasn't been that discussion, which I think is a problem. I think we talked lots about the waves of support and people turning up at the Russian embassies, the Ukrainian embassies, to want to go fight in Russia, and how much the country is sort of united. But we haven't actually had a conversation of your energy bills might go up because of that. But we think it's important for the sake of global stability and the concept of liberal democracy, which I think is a challenge, because, as we know, energy bills are something that people get very emotional about and are already in sort of spiking. And I think that if you don't have that honest conversation and you don't say, well, if you want to help the Ukrainians, you will have to pay a bit more, that's kind of what we're fighting for here, you are paving the way for all kinds of trouble down the road. On the Russian oligarchs in particular, like, we could have clamped down on dirty Russian money in London at any point over the last couple of decades. The reason that we haven't is because it kind of worked in our interests to have all of this Russian money coming in, and also to have a financial centre where we attract money from all over the world and we don't ask too many questions. And look, isn't our financial system wonderful, and isn't the City of London and Canary Wharf and our financial services literally world beating? Which it is, but there's a reason that they all want to come here. And if you look at the lists of how many Russian entities have been sanctioned in the UK versus various other countries, we're quite low on that list.
It's pretty feeble, right? Yeah.
But it's not for want of trying. It's because our legal system is very good at protecting anonymous oligarchs, and we don't know the ownership of half of these companies, because they're all shell companies that are registered in 6 different countries. And we set it up that way in order to be attractive. And we haven't really had a conversation about how Britain's success as a financial leader is kind of built on the fact that we make it very easy for dodgy people to bring their money here.
Well, I mean, it's as you say, it's sort of self-eating. It goes round in circles. Right now, you have the government attempting to pass sanctions on oligarchs, being, if not frustrated, then at least hampered in that by the activities of British lawyers employed in London by oligarchs. And once a country sells itself in the manner that we appear to have done, it's very, very hard to put it back in. Alistair, before we go to the news, on the extent to which we have to hurt ourselves. Well, no, I mean, I guess even more importantly than that, refugees. Do you think we're doing enough on refugees?
Self-evidently not. I mean, I think I just heard you say something against lawyers, which I've never had you down as a Priti Patel wannabe.
I think she attacks judges, doesn't she?
I think she attacks anyone. Someone who is so full of self-hatred, she's introducing bills that would prevent her own parents coming to the country. It's probably not the most even-handed. I mean, when you saw Yvette Cooper going with her at the dispatch box and this sort of mad scowl over her face, I think clearly she's caught in a bind of having to kowtow to the sort of Brexiteer anti-immigrant mentality. But this is a special case. I mean, I do disagree with what Rachel said, that we haven't hit the oligarchs. It's not for want of trying. I really think it is for want of trying. I'm pretty sure we could try a lot harder to hit the oligarchs. A very good example that would just set the tone is, whether they like it or not, the Tories are compromised by the amount of Russian-backed donations they have taken. A simple handing back of that money, which I know does not come easily to Boris Johnson unless it's handed to him by another donor, but a simple handing back of that money would make an incredibly strong statement. I think in terms of refugees, as Rachel says, our figure, this is part of the preposterousness of the sort of whole Brexit global Britain thing. We have to be world beating at everything. And you know what? We're not. And that's not a bad thing. We're a small nation off the north coast of Europe. We're not world leading. But when you look at that in terms of who we've sanctioned, it is pathetic.
Yeah. No,
and I just think there's no way of saying we are doing the best we could. There was a great, I can't remember, I was listening to the radio yesterday, someone was saying, announce who all these law firms are that are representing.
Yes, well, we had a leader saying exactly that in the Times last week, which I think it's a splendid idea. Look, we've had a bunch of tweets this morning. One of them I should read out because it's from Anna Soubry, the former Conservative and Remain MP, and she says, "Tell your comedy contributor not to blame Hertfordshire County Council for the state of his bins. He needs to harangue his district borough council. Just saying." Thank you very much, Anna Soubry. Look, if you want to stay up to date on the Ukrainian crisis, do remember you can listen to Times Radio any time of the day or night to get the latest developments. We'll bring you live news and the best analysis as soon as it happens, and there's more than one way to tune in. Of course, you can listen on a DAB digital radio at home and in the car, on our website and on our free smartphone app, and if you've got a smart speaker, simply say play Times Radio and it will do the rest. That's Times Radio, available whenever you want. Do keep getting in touch. I'll be speaking more with Rachel Cunliffe and Alistair Barry right after the latest news and sport.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
Good morning. There are reports that Russia is not observing this morning's agreed ceasefire in two cities with Ukraine. It was expected to hold for 5 hours in Mariupol and Volnovakha. Reports from Mariupol say Russian shelling is continuing along parts of the evacuation route, preventing civilians from escaping. The evacuation of people from the city was due to get underway at 9 o'clock UK time. So Kim Darroch, a former national security advisor, told Times Radio he's not holding out hope that the temporary ceasefire in the two areas of southern Ukraine would lead to anything wider.
In terms of this leading to anything bigger, any sort of ceasefire process or peace process, I'm kind of sceptical, I'm afraid. I wish it were otherwise. But it seems to me that Putin is doubling down on his strategy of trying to take as much of Ukraine as he can. At the moment, it looks like trying to cut the country in half, really along the Dnieper River.
Elsewhere in Ukraine, fighting and bombardments have continued. The Ministry of Defence says Ukraine does hold control of key cities such as Kharkiv, Chernihiv and Mariupol, but there have been reports of street fighting in Sumy, and the MOD says it's highly likely that all 4 cities are now surrounded by Russian forces. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused NATO of giving the green light to the bombing of Ukrainian cities and villages. It comes after NATO leaders ruled out implementing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. The NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said the alliance had made what he called the painful decision. And Russia has blocked Facebook and reportedly Twitter and YouTube in the country. The Russian parliament approved a law yesterday that would make it a criminal offence punishable by up to 15 years in prison to spread what they say is fake or false news about the Kremlin's war in Ukraine. The BBC, CNN, Bloomberg and CBS have all announced they're suspending either operations or broadcasts in the country, saying the law criminalises independent reporting in the country. In other news, the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has said Shane Warne's family will be offered a state funeral for him. The cricketing legend died aged 52 in Thailand yesterday from a suspected heart attack. Cloud and occasional rain in the southeast, moving into central areas of England. It will be drier and brighter for parts of East Anglia and mainly dry with sunny spells elsewhere. Tom Clayton has the sport.
The Russian F1 driver Nikita Mazepin has been dropped by his team Haas for the 2022 season. In a statement, the team says they are shocked and saddened by the invasion of Ukraine and have also ended their title sponsorship of Russian mining firm Uralkali, which is owned by Mazepin's father, Dmitry Mazepin. In a statement, Mazepin says he'll have more to say in coming days, but no process was followed in this unilateral step. Shane Warne has been described as a cricket genius following the news of his passing yesterday. The Melbourne Cricket Ground, a site where Warne produced multiple memorable performances, including against England, will rename their Grand South stand the SK Warne stand in his honour. The former England captain, David Gower, told Times Radio he was a nightmare to play against.
Part of his skill was that ability to, as some have said this morning, instill fear in a batsman. I mean, the fear of being embarrassed. I mean, not just the fear of being got out. The fear of being absolutely embarrassed by this magician. I mean, it was possible to score runs against him. I mean, I would say, in all honesty, yes, I would have hoped to score some runs. And yes, he would have got me out.
The Winter Paralympian Millie Knight says winning another medal was a surprise after adding a second bronze to her career total. Her third place finish in the visually impaired downhill event this morning means she's now won 4 medals in 2 games and GB's first in Beijing.
Like we said, it's something that we never thought we'd achieve again. It's a crazy feeling, and I don't think either of us have fully taken it in yet and absorbed what's actually happening. I think tonight when we get our medals will be very, very special.
And no Premier League football games will be shown in China this weekend over planned displays of unity with Ukraine from all clubs. The Premier League's chief executive, Richard Masters, is also reviewing broadcast contracts in Russia. Here in the UK, you can hear live coverage of all of the Premier League and EFL action over on Talk Sport. Later, you can hear Liverpool host West Ham. That's exclusive to Talk Sports from 5:30.
This is Times Radio.
Whether you fancy moving to the country or dream of taking early retirement, a tax-efficient stocks and shares ISA from John Lewis can help you prepare for all the big milestones to come. Little moments can build big futures. Go to johnlewisfinance.com to find out more. As with all investing, your capital is at risk. Tax treatment depends on individual circumstances and may change in the future. John Lewis Investment Services are provided by Nutmeg Saving and Investment Limited.
Hugo Rifkind on Times Radio with Net Wealth. Wealth management as it should be. Find out more at netwealth.com.
Hello, this is Hugo Rifkind here on Times Radio. It is 10:38 exactly. Lots coming up on the show today. After midday, when I will still be here, I'll be speaking to the novelist Andrei Kurkov. He'll be joining us from Ukraine to discuss the situation there and about being tipped off that he's on Russia's wanted list. And I'll be speaking to the award-winning crime writer Anne Cleves about her latest book, The Heron's Cry, and the comedian Sarah Kendall about Series 2 of her Sky comedy drama Frayed. Plus, I'll have politics with Caroline Wheeler. After 11, so sooner than that, pretty soon, I'll be speaking to the Times diplomatic correspondent Catherine Philp, who's often on this show. She's in Kiev in Ukraine, and she'll be telling me what's going on there. And I'll be speaking to Howard Jacobson about his new memoir, and Jenny Colwyn will be joining me for the TV review. So stay tuned for all of that, if for any reason you weren't going to, although I'm sure you were. But before all of that, I'm halfway through my review of the week's news with the journalist Rachel Cunliffe and the comedian Alistair Barry. And the next thing I wanted to talk about, guys, I thought we'll get away from Ukraine for a little bit, talk about a very, very, very different sort of tragedy. Neighbours is being cancelled after 37 years. The Australian drama it's been with us. Well, I wouldn't say all my life, but close to all my life, probably more than your life, Rachel. I would have thought so. What does it mean to you? The end of Neighbours. It means a lot to me. Saying goodbye to Harold Bishop, Madge Bishop, Bouncer. You know, looking back in the days when Charlene was a mechanic, Paul Robertson running Lassiter's, forever worried about Mr. Udagawa. All gone, all gone, all gone. Rachel, you're young. Do you have any idea what I'm talking about?
I'm going to be honest. I kind of had the option of prepping for Ukraine or prepping for Neighbours, and I chose Ukraine, hopefully successfully. I don't know, listen back and you can see. I I have no idea what you just said. I know it's very emotional. 37 years seems like a very long time for any show to keep running, especially as I think most of the characters seem to have spent most of their lives drinking. Is that fair in the middle of the day?
Drinking beer out of very, very small glasses and in a fairly horrendous wine bar at Lassiter's, owned, as I said, by Mr. Udagawa.
It's Australian beer, so I guess it's basically like water, right? So it doesn't count.
I mean, that's fighting talk. I don't know if you've ever tried a VB.
This is the problem with the youth of today. You've grown up with just so much good stuff to watch on television that you didn't have to watch. Neighbours was the best thing in all our lives for years. Alistair, help me out here.
I just had the most enormous Proustian rush from everything you just described, Hugo. And I mean, I was delighted to see Stefan Dennis is still in the show.
He can't be, is he?
He's 63 now. There's a picture on the Mail online of him taking office furniture out, considerably smaller than Vladimir Putin's, because he may have been a bad man, but he was never in that league. I think, I'm not sure quite how old you are, Rachel, but I'm thinking 30s. So people of my generation and Hugo's generation, there was this strange thing that happened at some point in the 80s where we found ourselves, I was at boarding school and literally the entire school would stop at lunchtime, dive into the TV room and we were addicted, and that's not too strong a word, utterly addicted to this strange... I've never been addicted to a soap, but Neighbours I definitely was. That sort of transformed as I went to university, and I must admit there was a terrible time at university when I was probably taking a little bit too much interest in certain recreational substances, and I would genuinely get up, watch the lunchtime Neighbours, sit there on the sofa all afternoon, and then watch the repeat and see how much of it I could remember. It defined our kind of youth and young adulthood in a retrospect utterly bizarre way. When you start thinking, Stefan Dennis had his own had a dreadful single. They all made singles because Charlene, aka Kylie,
it was called "Did It Make You Feel Good?"
Oh my God, Hugo!
Don't it make you feel good?
Fan are you?
I'm a huge fan, but it turns out my producer Danny is an even greater fan because he just said that in my ear and corrected me when I got it wrong.
But they did. They all made music. They all came over here, and it's quite funny when you go over. I went slightly off track, but I went to New Zealand to do the New Zealand Comedy Festival with a friend of mine, Paul Sinner, who is the chaser on ITV. And the chase is enormous over there because they show it at prime time. So Paul, who's a wonderful comedian and relatively well-known over here, was a superstar over there. And that's what used to happen to them. They'd be filming, they just, run-of-the-mill actors filming a soap opera in Melbourne. And then they'd get on a plane and arrive and just be royalty. And I mean, the extent to which Scott and Charlene's wedding was, in many senses, bigger and, let's face it, probably more successful than the marriage of Charles and Diana. I think.
Do you remember the shock of seeing Angry Anderson on Top of the Pops and going, the guy who sang that song looks like this?
I remember, what was it? Oh, God, Craig, the one who played Henry.
Craig McLachlan.
Craig McLachlan had a big career as a sort of covers artist. I mean, in retrospect, it does feel like something of a fever dream. How the late 80s and early 90s, how we were addicted to it. I haven't watched an episode for many years.
You're part of the problem then.
No, absolutely, exactly. No, I mean, I must admit, I drifted away in the long wilderness toadfish years, and never really went back. Apparently, he's still in it. Says Danny, who knows a suspicious amount about Neighbours. But look, it's gone. It's over. We will always have Plain Jane Superbrain taking off her glasses and wooing Mike. She's not in it. Stop it.
What a moment that was.
Apparently, she's. Oh my God, they're all in it. Anyway, we are sorry. Apparently, Britain has been keeping Neighbours afloat for many, many years. No longer is. It's dying because of us. What have we done, etc. I should say I've got Sarah Kendall on the show later talking about Frayed, and Frayed is in many respects a parody, if not of Neighbours, then more of Home and Away, which is basically the same thing. So do stick around for that.
Wonderful comedians.
Yes, absolutely, and it's a great show. It's a great show too. Let's move on. More serious story. Should we talk about a more serious story? No, let's not. Let's talk about Gavin Williamson. He's been knighted.
That is a serious story.
Gavin Williamson, the man who told Russia to go away and shut up, has been knighted now. When it shows that they didn't go away and shut up. Famously, he's been sacked from a string of jobs. He's been, I would say, I know we need to have balance on this show, but I would say nonetheless famously terrible at everything. Yet he's been knighted. What's going on there, Rachel? Do you think?
knighted for services to making sure the rest of us never feel imposter syndrome ever again. I think. Now, the interesting thing about Gavin Williamson is that when he lost his job in the cabinet reshuffle last year, you would have expected somebody to speak up for him. Surely there would be some faction of the notoriously factional
the
Conservative
Williamsonites,
Party.
yes.
Who would be saying, no, this is like, how dare they? He's a fine, upstanding education secretary. I can't even say that without gagging. But no, every single Conservative I spoke to from every faction went, yeah, he should have been sacked ages ago. I mean, he messed up the A-levels COVID fiasco. He also sort of seemed to see that his job as education secretary was launching culture war attacks on unsuspecting Oxford students who dared to have mixed feelings about the Queen, rather than, I don't know, making sure that millions of children could continue learning during a pandemic. He sent them all back to school for one day before lockdown in January 2021. That was a particular highlight. This obviously is all after he was sacked from Theresa May's cabinet for leaking details from a classified meeting about the security implications of the Chinese tech giant Huawei, which obviously he denies. Well, he would say that, wouldn't he? And now he's got a knighthood, and they haven't even bothered to say what it's for. They haven't even tried. They've just said, "Arise, Sir Gavin."
Yeah.
So obviously he has some dirt on Boris Johnson, and maybe he knows where the extra babies are.
Dear me.
Yes. Live ones, I should say. This is the man who kept a pet tarantula on his desk when he was chief whip to try and intimidate Tory MPs, and he was photographed after the A-levels fiasco with a riding crop on his desk, just in case you didn't get the message.
That he used to be a whip, yeah.
Yeah, with some very distressing S&M undertones there that I don't like to think too much about.
Dear me. But on the other hand, Alistair, what's good about him?
Oh, God. Do you know what? I think there is a real problem with... we live in an age of dispute and disunity and fights across the floor of the House of Commons, and no one can agree on anything. I think there is one thing that we can all agree that unites the country in a very difficult and diverse time, is everyone thinks Gavin Williamson is absolutely useless. I mean, I was reading the Telegraph this morning, and Camilla Tominey, who I don't agree with on many things, genuinely said everything I've thought about Gavin Williamson, that it was a national embarrassment. I mean, I suppose the only thing you can say in his favour is that, at least unlike Grayling, his name doesn't rhyme with failing, because if it did, he has screwed up on so many levels. And I genuinely... it basically shows how flawed the honours system is, and I think we have to agree. You look at the House of Lords, which is now packed with Johnson's cronies, in a sense. I mean, and to be fair, Labour cronies as well. It's a hideous aberration for all government that we have this second house that is stuffed with lords who are basically awarded. I mean, awarded peerages for what? And in this case, he's awarded a knighthood. I think one thing we are seeing as a sort of outcome of all this stuff from Ukraine and Brexit and everything else is how many of our institutions and systems are fundamentally compromised. And the ludicrousness of giving a man who has failed upwards at every single turn a knighthood. I mean, to be honest, if I meet Gavin Williamson, I'm not going to call him sir.
Well, he's apparently quite popular with Conservative MPs. I've heard from friends of Gavin Williamson, but no, genuinely, apparently is. I'm sure there must be a reason, although God knows what it is. Look, stick with us. After 11 on this programme, I've got analysis from Kyiv with the Times diplomatic correspondent Catherine Philp, and then the award-winning novelist Howard Jacobson will be talking about his new memoir. This is Hugo Rifkind on Times Radio in association with NetWealth. Find out more at netwealth.com.
Wake up to Britain's brightest early breakfast with Callum MacDonald on Times Radio with Nutmeg, the digital wealth manager. Thought-provoking analysis, insight and debate as the day's biggest stories break. Plus, get all the latest economic and financial news expertly unpacked in the dedicated Daily Business Bulletin. Early Breakfast with Callum MacDonald. Monday morning from 5 on Times Radio in association with Nutmeg, the digital wealth manager. Put your money where your mind is. As with all investing, your capital is at risk.
Oh, traffic. We're going to be so late. Oh, we're going to miss the vows. Everyone will see us sneak in. So embarrassing. We'll have to get changed in a lay-by. Oh, look. McDonald's. See, they're doing a chicken Big Mac. Probably best to just blend into the crowd after. It's not like we're family.
Welcome back, the Chicken Big Mac. But hurry, it's only here till 15th of March. Served after 11 a.m, subject to availability at participating restaurants until the 15th of March.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker, this is Times Radio with Hugo Rifkind.
Hello, this is Hugo Rifkind here on Times Radio. It is 10 to 11, which means I have 10 minutes left with the pleasure of the company of the journalist Rachel Cunliffe and the comedian Alistair Barry. So let's make them work for it. The next thing, guys, I wanted to talk about. Let's see, what did I want to talk about? Okay, serious news. At least more serious than Neighbours and Gavin Williamson, which we've just been talking about. We found out Professor Graham Medley, who was on Sage, advising the government through the pandemic. This week he answered questions from MPs on the Common Science and Technology Committee about why Sage modellers got their forecasts so wrong. And they did get them very wrong. During the Omicron wave, they predicted up to 6,000 deaths a day. And in fact, we peaked at about, I think, 306. And they say the reason why they failed is that they failed to anticipate how much people's behaviour changed. Basically, they failed to anticipate that the moment you warn people that bad things are coming, people change stuff so that bad things don't come. Although I'm not sure my behaviour did change that much during Omicron. I think Omicron is one we slightly sort of strolled through. Rachel, what do you think about this?
I think this just shows that the trouble with modelling, which is something that we kind of knew before COVID, and then COVID happened and we raised up all these epidemiologists and modellers as superstars who could predict the future and who could guide us through this, understandably because we were all terrified and we wanted anyone who could give us any guidance whatsoever. And what they're paid to do, what they're trained to do, is to model a range of scenarios, including the worst case scenario. And then if you take the worst case scenario to policymakers, that's the one that they focus on. That's the one that makes it into the headlines. And then obviously people change their behaviour because they are terrified. But I think that they were never, I guess, trying to, or originally they weren't trying to say what is actually going to happen. They were only ever saying what could happen. Mm-hmm. And we just all got so fixated on this is the gospel that it went a bit too far. And some of that is on the scientists, the SAGE modelers themselves. I'm not going to name names, but there are certain scientists who, over the course of the pandemic, seem to have enjoyed giving really doom-laden interviews, even at moments when things were going quite well, and to say, oh, you can't do that because everyone will die. And the more they say that, the more they get booked for TV appearances. Many of them didn't do that at all. Mm-hmm. But it was us. It was us trying to seek knowledge and facts where facts didn't exist. And so you got a sort of catastrophizing doom loop, which then, thankfully, with Omicron didn't come to pass.
Yeah, I mean, I think doom loop is a very good way of talking about it. I still do find it weird how people talk about how we survived the Omicron wave without too much lockdown and extrapolate backwards to say that this means we should never have any lockdown, because, of course, the difference is we're all intensely vaccinated these days, or at least most of us are, and numbers of infection remain absolutely huge in terms of how they were for the past 2 years. But Alistair, what did you think about this one?
I tend to agree with all of that. I think there was a very good article in The Spectator, actually, Michael Simmons, which I agreed with almost entirely. What unfortunately the SAGE people have done is made the classic error in modern parlance of admitting they were wrong. And as soon as you've admitted you've made a mistake, I think the modelling was clearly out of whack, especially in terms of Omicron and certain variables that they just simply failed to take into account. People's behaviour, looking at the South African information. There was also that element that they prepared for the worst case scenario, because if it was the worst case scenario, and then they'd be, well, why didn't you tell us? Mm-hmm. But they actually ended up preparing for a worse than worst case scenario. My personal opinion is that the whole problem with lockdowns from the start is that we took a blanket approach to everything. Obviously, there was definite reasons for lockdowns at the start, but there should have been a much better way of protecting the more vulnerable, perhaps letting other parts of society get on with things in a, I'm not an epidemiologist, so I'm not going to pretend I know the facts, etc. But it seems very clear that the modelling was wrong. There are reasons for it. And the main thing we need to do is learn from the pandemic. And hopefully this is actually part of that process, rather than just demonising people who I think generally speaking, were very much trying to do their job.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely fair. Look, we've got space for another one. So this is a story that I just could not get my head around this week at all. It was in the Daily Mail. It was about the dating app Badoo, and I've no idea what that is because I'm a middle-aged man who hasn't been on a date since 1997. Nonetheless, it was about how young people go on dates these days. They meet up for breakfast, they go to classes, and they go to the gym. Rachel, on behalf of your people, what the hell is this? The gym.
I cannot defend this. So I will say that the idea is that young people are very, very busy and we've got to cram all our dating in because we missed 2 years of it and there aren't enough hours in the day. So it makes sense to go on a date and do something that you would have done anyway. So everyone has breakfast, everyone has coffee. So that's what you do rather than dinner and cocktails, because otherwise you end up having a lot of expensive dinner and cocktails out and you get very, very drunk and very fat. But on the gym point, I'm getting married next month and I have been to the gym with my partner exactly once and we both agreed after that, never again. You are at your least attractive at the gym. I'm speaking for everyone here. The idea of you've never met someone before, you've seen their highly doctored, flattering photos on an app, and then you decide to spend 45 minutes doing a HIIT class, getting sweaty and panting and competing with each other. It just does not sound fun.
I mean, I suppose I was thinking about this, the sort of person who would be prepared to go on a date at the gym is probably going to be pretty hot, you'd think. But the downside of it will, of course, be that you too will be at the gym. so it kind of, it's swings and roundabouts, really. Alistair, what about you? Ever had a date at the gym?
I've never had a date at the gym, but what you've just said has given me pause for thought about it. And the horrible idea of being invited by someone who's ludicrously fit and watching you sort of struggle away on the cross trainer for half an hour and then decide you have to hit the pub fairly rapidly afterwards. I don't know. To be honest, I find the whole thing so desperately confusing because as like you, a middle-aged man who is very happily married, the whole idea of dating. I mean, I have never been on an internet date. I come from the era where you literally had to just simply disappoint people with the power of your own personality. And I have a couple of friends who've recently become single again at my age who are looking at the dating apps with absolute terror and horror. I am lucky enough to be in the position that, as far as I'm aware, I'm very happily married. The idea of going on a date, the idea of any of that sort of stuff, obviously with my wife, we do make time for that and it's very happy and blah, blah, blah. But the idea of going on a date, the idea of an affair, I don't know how anyone has time for an affair. I have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, absolutely no idea how any of this works. So I probably feel about this in much the same way that Rachel feels about Neighbours.
Yeah, the affair thing, I was in awe of Matt Hancock for managing it. I thought the guy was very, very busy. The fact that he managed to do this as well. I mean, look, dating culture itself. Rachel, again, it's treating you as the representative of all younger people in the world everywhere. I think Alice and I are both of a generation where there weren't dates. There was maybe go to the pub with somebody you vaguely knew, and then you'd you have a few drinks and you wake up 25 years later and you're married. It's basically, it's how it worked. This whole kind of thing of like, well, I'll go out with this person to see if I like them. That's just sick, isn't it?
I think it's very American. That's what I think. I think it's come over from America, and America sort of popularised the idea that a date was dinner and a movie, and actually going to the cinema with someone is the worst way to get to know them because you spend a lot of money just sitting in silence for 2 hours. So I think dating as a concept, I think it came from Friends maybe, that 90s Americanized culture. But in terms of online dating, I have done it. It is horrendous. You end up having a lot of really, really awkward conversations when you work out in the first 5 minutes that you're probably quite nice, but I don't want to spend the rest of my life with you, or indeed the rest of this evening. And it's very awkward. My one piece of advice to anyone doing it would be just cut your losses and just say that early on. Otherwise, you waste so much time. Don't go to the gym. If you want to meet someone at the gym, go to the gym and meet people there. Don't try and combine the two things.
But don't do that either because it's creepy. Alistair, look, before I let you go, you're doing a stand-up for Ukraine at the Comedy Store this Tuesday,
yes,
right?
Yes, I am.
Tell us about it quickly.
Well, very quickly, Sarah Keyworth, lovely comedian, put out a tweet. I'd already contacted the Comedy Store to try and organise a benefit, so we joined forces with the wonderful production company called Burke's Nest, who've put it all together. James Acaster, Nish Kumar, Sindhu V. Who else is on this? A really phenomenally good bill.
Yeah.
And it is sold out, but there is talk. Well, there is going to be a streaming service. So I don't have the link to hand at the moment, but there will be streaming of it.
We'll tweet that out later. We'll tweet that out later for sure. Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, Alistair Barry and Rachel Cunliffe. Speak to you both again very, very soon.
Pleasure.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio.
It's 11 o'clock. I'm Hugo Rifkind, and this is Times Radio. Thanks for your many tweets and texts in the last hour. And apologies to Richard Anderson, who said, I hope Hugo is not going to finish this hour without mentioning Partygate. You know what? I did. Disgraceful. We've got lots and lots coming up on this show. Pretty soon I'm going to be speaking to the Times diplomatic correspondent, Catherine Phil. She is in Kyiv. She's often on this show, Catherine, but she's in Kyiv at the moment. She's a diplomatic correspondent, as I said. She'll be giving us the latest from Ukraine. But before all of that, let's get a roundup of the latest news with Anna Cunningham.
Hugo, thank you. Good morning. Local officials in the southern Ukrainian city of Mariupol say a ceasefire agreed this morning is not being observed by Russian troops. There are reports of continued shelling along parts of the evacuation route where it had been hoped that thousands of civilians would be allowed to leave the city safely. The ceasefire agreement between Russia and Ukraine was due to hold for 5 hours in the cities of Mariupol and Volnovakha. The Times war correspondent Anthony Lloyd is in Dnipro. Earlier, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky had urged in a video posted on Facebook that men who can stay should stay and fight in the city. More than 1 million people are said to have now fled Ukraine, but the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, Filippo Grandi, who's in Moldova, says that figure is rising. The Ministry of Defence says Ukraine continues to hold control of the key cities of Kharkiv, Chernihiv and Mariupol, but there had been reports of street fighting in Sumy, and the MOD says it's highly likely that all 4 cities are now surrounded by Russian forces. It says Russian forces are also advancing on the southern port city of Mykolaiv, and the MOD says over the past 24 hours there have been a lower number of Russian air and artillery strikes observed than in previous days. The Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has accused NATO of giving the green light to the bombing of Ukrainian cities and villages. It comes after NATO leaders ruled out implementing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. The NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg said the alliance had made what he called the painful decision. And the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, just to bring you this breaking news, the Foreign and Commonwealth and Development Office has now advised Britons whose presence is not essential to consider leaving Russia. It says that it advises against all travel to the whole of Russia due to the lack of available flight options to return to the UK and the increased volatility in the Russian economy, and that it now strongly advises that people consider leaving by remaining commercial routes. And Russia has blocked Facebook and reportedly Twitter and YouTube in the country. The Russian parliament approved a law yesterday that would make it a criminal offence punishable by up to 15 years in prison to spread what they say is fake or false news about the Kremlin's war in Ukraine. The BBC, CNN, Bloomberg and CBS have all announced that they're suspending either operations or broadcasts in the country, saying the law criminalises independent reporting in the country. And in other news, the Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison has said Shane Warne's family will be offered a state funeral for him. The cricketing legend died at the age of 52 in Thailand yesterday from a suspected heart attack. A look at the weather: cloud and occasional rain in the southeast, moving into central areas of England. Drier and brighter for parts of East Anglia later. Mainly dry with sunny spells elsewhere. And our top top sports story this hour. The Russian Formula One driver Nikita Mazepin has been dropped by his team Haas for the 2022 season. In a statement, the team says they are shocked and saddened by the invasion of Ukraine. They've not yet confirmed who will replace Mazepin in the team. We'll have a full sports roundup at past.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, and via your smart speaker.
Hugo Rifkind on Times Radio with NetWealth. Wealth management as it should be.
Hello, this is Hugo Rifkind here on Times Radio with news, current affairs, culture and conversation right up until 1pm. It is currently about 11:05. Thanks very much for being with me. After 12, I'll be talking with the Ukrainian writer Andrei Kurkov about the conflict in his country and about being tipped off that he's on Russia's wanted list. Around 12:15, I'll be joined by the crime novelist Anne Cleves to chat about her new book, The Heron's Cry. And after 12:30, the comedian Sarah Kendall will be chatting to me about her comedy drama Frayed on Sky Max. So there's a lot coming up. There's more TV actually as well after 11:30 with Jenny Colgan. She'll be reviewing Peaky Blinders, Killing Eve, Chernobyl, The Lost Tapes and The Dropout on Disney+. If you've seen any of those, do send me your thoughts. Text us on 87222. Start your message with the word Times. Tweet us at Times Radio or email us on studio@times.radio as ever. And in around 10 minutes' time, I'll be speaking to the Booker Prize-winning novelist Howard Jacobson about his new memoir, Mother's Boy. And indeed, I can see him out the window right now. But first, I'm joined by the Times diplomatic correspondent Catherine Philp, who is in Kyiv to discuss the latest on the conflict in Ukraine. Hello, Catherine. How are you?
Hello, Hugo. I'm fine, thank you.
Thanks very much for being with us. Slightly later than normal and in somewhat different circumstances.
Indeed. One of the more unusual calls I've done into your show.
Yes, indeed. Well, I'm not going to ask you about all the usual things, such as whether you go on dates in the gym. I'm going to ask you about Ukraine. Look, news this morning of a ceasefire in two areas, allowing civilians to evacuate. Which areas and what more do we know?
Those are areas quite a long way from Kyiv. So we're talking about Kharkiv and Mariupol, which have been surrounded and taken very heavy bombardment. So the hope is that civilians who want to leave those areas will be able to get out safely. They just have not been able to do that under the current bombardment.
And when we talk about evacuation, do we know, how will that happen? In what direction will they be able to go? Is this evacuation towards Russia or going the other way?
That will very much depend on where those people want to go. The forces are surrounding those cities, so my guess is that they will, whatever direction they get out of the city, they are most likely to want to go west towards Poland. There may be people, say, in Kharkiv who want to go to Russia. It is very close to the Russian border and has got very strong links with Russia. There's a large population living there. But obviously, east is not the direction that most Ukrainians want to flee in, given that's where the aggression is coming from.
Of course. Look, and tell us about in Kyiv at the moment. What's the latest from the fighting around there, and how are residents feeling?
Yeah, I'm actually driving down a road in Kyiv as we speak. Just been to visit the zoo, as you do. It's actually, Kyiv has, after several days of being incredibly deserted when it was first getting pounded by missiles and shelling on the outskirts, it's actually come slightly back to life again. The trams are running, which stopped for a while, extraordinarily. We've even managed to pick up some coffee. So people, I think, have, going into the second week of this invasion, I think people are starting to learn to live with what's going on, and also appreciating that given that Russian troops are outside the capital and